Okay, in this video we're going to look at basic real-time keying, setting up a material in Unreal Engine so that we can take our green screen footage, blue screen, whatever, and bring it onto geometry into the scene so that we have the flexibility to navigate around the scene and have it appear that this video is just part of the entire Unreal scenes. The approach that I'm going to cover is just one of many. There are other approaches to this, but this one has been around the longest, so it's supported by older versions of Unreal Engine. It runs entirely in the real-time materials, so it's not a post-process, so it is really, really fast. As a feature film compositor, former feature film compositor, I do have some misgivings about some of the mathematics in it, but it actually does work really, really well, and it is really simple to set up. So we're going to use this as our first intro into compositing video in Unreal Engine. And another really nice advantage of this is it sets up really easily for any source of video. So this will work for real-time live coming in. In my case, this is a Blackmagic Decklink board. It'll work with Audio board sources. It'll work with a USB video source. It'll work with a video file. It'll work with a still image. So let's get into that. Basically, the reason it works with all of those types of modes of image source is that all of those sources can ultimately become a 2D texture in your Unreal Engine content. So in my case, I have my Blackmagic Decklink board. It's being captured by a media bundle. That bundle has a folder associated with it. And so if I double click on the bundle, here's where my Blackmagic configuration is. And when that bundle was generated, it was creating a folder that associates with it. And inside that folder is the 2D texture of the live real-time video coming into that board. Now, if I had used a USB video source, that connects using a media player, the real important thing is to make sure that media player is writing output to a texture. So if I were to right-click Content, for example, choose Media and Media Player, I get a dialog box asking me if I want to set up an output media texture. Definitely turn that on. That is what will result in a media texture for your video source. I'm going to hit cancel because I've already got my video source set up. That same option comes up if you're going to use that media player for a video file or an image sequence. This is going to work for all of them because all of these different modes of bringing in the video or images ultimately result in the creation of a 2D texture that we can use with this approach. All right, so let's really get to work on that. So I'm just going to pull over to a different part of my scene, and I'm just going to create a piece of geometry that we can work with and see how the work is going. W, of course, translate, and E for rotation. I've got 10 degree snapping on, so I'll just rotate this down 90 degrees and rotate it closer 90 degrees, and now we can see that plane. And very quickly I can generate a master material just by taking my texture, dragging it, and dropping it right onto that plane. All right, so now I've got a master material set up, and this is where we'll define our keying setup. We'll use material instances, basically copies of this material, to actually do the keying work. Let's rename this while we're here. So I'm just going to click on this and call this keying _ master _ MAT for material. And then double click to open up our material editor. All right, so in the material editor here, we have by default the material node itself is selected, and sure enough, there's our texture sample. That is the texture that we brought in from the actual video input. Now, we're going to use instances of this to have different possible keys, and maybe each one of those instances would want to support a different texture. Maybe I've got multiple videos, or I've got video files that I also want to key. This is an opportunity to make the texture a parameter so that each one of those instances could actually be the same copy of the material definition, the material master, but each one of them could use a different texture. So right away, I'm just going to right click on my texture sample and convert it to a parameter so that later on, if I had the inclination, I could use different textures for different instances. I'm just going to call this keying key source. There we go. So that'll be the name of that, and this name that I typed in, that is how it's going to show up as a parameter when we get to edit our instances. All right, so by default, RGB is connected to base color. That's fine for here. Actually, I'm just going to double click and then hit the delete key, get rid of that connection so we start out fresh. Because what we're going to do is use a material function set up for the keying process itself. And to add that, I'm just going to right click here in an empty space, type in MF for material function, _C to bring up our chroma keyer. Yes, okay, this is where the feature film compositor in me starts to die just a little bit. Chroma keyer is honestly just not my favorite keying approach, but again, this is well supported in Unreal. It is lightning fast and it does work. So I'm just going to swallow that for now and continue on. All right, so with our keyer, we're going to bring the RGB from our texture and drop that into the input color. And then the emissive color can go out to emissive color. We don't have to connect to base color. The base color is really going to be how responsive the plane is to any sunlight or other interactive lights in our scene. I'm actually just going to leave that disconnected because generally I'm just going to want the output of the chroma keyer colors to be the values that we see on the geometry. If I want that geometry to be responsive to light and shadow in the scene, then I'd also connect emissive color to base color. All right, so the big piece that's missing right now is being able to apply opacity. Our material doesn't have that enabled, so let's work on that. Selecting here, I'm just selecting the material node. If we go down here to the left, we have a couple settings that are really important. There's the material domain, and that's surface, and that's correct. You know, it's going to be on a surface in the scene. But the blend mode is opaque. Opaque does not support any type of opacity or transparency. We have a couple choices when it comes to transparency support. Masked is one. I'm going to select that now, and that enables opacity mask, and I might as well connect that while we're here. Opacity to opacity masked. Now there's some attributes of mask that are really important to know about. One, it casts shadows. It's really nice. You can see here in the demo, we're casting a shadow, and that shadow is honoring the transparency of the material. So if I key out the green screen, the light will pass through that, and the solid areas of the plane will actually cast a shadow. So that's one really important aspect of a masked material. Another one is that it supports shallow depth of field. So if I have a cinematic camera, wide aperture, shallow depth of field, and this plane were to be moved back in a way outside of the focal area, well, it'll blur, just like every other object in the scene that's out beyond the field of view, or I'm sorry, not field of view, depth of field, will blur. The side effect, the problem with a masked blend mode material is that pixels in that material can only be one of two things. They're either transparent or they're opaque, solid. There is no partial transparency support in a masked material. So as you can see here, there are transparent pixels, and they're completely 100% transparent, and then there are solid pixels, and they are completely 100% solid. There is no in between. The setting down here for the threshold at which that happens is it's usually hidden. I'm going to click this triangle so you can see that by default, a lot of times the material panel will look like this. And if you still have this little triangle collapse, you can just click it to expand, and you'll see there's an opacity mask clip value. This is the threshold at which a pixel becomes transparent. So in my case, anytime alpha channel is above about 1/3, 0.333, that will be a transparent pixel. If the pixel alpha channel is below 0.333, it'll be transparent. If it's above, it's solid. Right, so if I increase this, I should end up with more and more of my, yeah, there we go. More of this material is transparent. If I were to decrease this, it would be more solid. Actually, if I just set this to, let's say, 0.1, you can see now that we're getting completely solid. There are no partially transparent pixels, so that's really important to know. I'm going to leave this set to its default 0.3333. Okay, so that's one choice, and so it's important to make an informed choice. The other option is translucent materials, and I'm going to usually choose translucent. This is going to give us a better fidelity in the composite because translucent blend mode supports partial transparency. So if you have fine wisps of hair, if you've got a sheer material in your subject, the translucent material is going to give you that semi-transparency support. The two side effects of that are that, unlike the masked material, translucent does not cast shadows, nor does it honor depth of field for cinematic cameras. So you could put this side by side with an object plane that has a masked material or an opaque material. They could be outside of the depth of field, and an opaque or masked material plane will be blurred and out of focus, whereas the translucent one will be perfectly sharp because the shallow depth of field is not supported by the translucent material. Okay, so I tend to use my compositing planes as a in focus plane. I rarely try to blur that. So I'm just going to stick with translucent, and it has a different opacity parameter. It's opacity instead of opacity mask. So I'm just going to go ahead and reconnect that opacity to opacity. Now going forward, if I were to switch back and forth between these, the connection from opacity to opacity mask, it's still there. So I can go to masked, and that connection's there. I can switch to translucent, and that connection is there. So I could later on switch between these depending on the objects that I planned on compositing on. But for now, I'm just going to keep translucent. And now you can make an informed decision the next time you're setting up your compositing material. All right, so we defined a parameter here for the texture. One of the functions of the material function chroma key here is that it has a load of compositing parameters built in, and we'll be able to use those once we start creating instances of this master material. So let's get to work on that. I'm going to save this, and we'll just move this over and close it out and start getting to work on creating an instance. So I will right-click this master and create a material instance. And we'll just give this a, I'll just call it BMD underscore keyer underscore MI for material instance. And there we go. And you can see it's a instance is a bright green bar underneath the icon in the content browser where, I'm sorry, it's a dark green for the material instance, and the master material is a bright green. All right, so now when I double click the material instance, I get a completely different material editor. And this time I've got all of the parameters that I defined. So right down here, there's a texture parameter. It's called key source. That's that texture parameter I created. So if I wanted to, I could activate this parameter and drag a different texture into here. So if I make multiple instances of my master material, each one could actually be keying a different texture. All right, we're just going to stick to the one we have now. Let me preview this on a plane. Here we are. And now let's get to work on setting up our key. So I just want to be able to see the source material. You can see that the spill suppression is already active, so I don't really have my natural green screen color here. That's why I'm just exposing the texture in the content browser. So that way I can go activate the key color, click on the color bar, select our eyedropper, and then I'll just take a value from the green screen. Let's sample from this shadow. Yeah, not too bad. I mean, it gets us to a pretty good start. So we'll say OK. And if I roll down this triangle here, we can see the RGB values. And we can just work on each one of those one at a time to see if there's any improvement we can get. I'm just rolling my mouse wheel forward to get a little bit more zoom. You can see that these are semi-transparent because we did translucent, but they're not 100% transparent. So I'm just going to grab green first, since that's the main green screen color, and slide this forward and backward. And you can see that my transparency gets better and worse. And I'm just trying to find where's the sweet spot in that pendulum swing. And it looks like right about here. All right, that's good enough for the green channel. And I just repeat that back and forth, click and drag in each, the red and the blue channels. Same thing, just go back and forth until I kind of find that sweet spot. That was red and finally blue. And there we go. All right, so that's the best we can do with just the color alone. Now, of course, we still have some issues here. Let's address those with our alpha controls. So let's activate all of those. Each one of these has a different function, of course. The Luma mask is particularly useful for me because I tend to wear black shirts. And the chair behind me is gray, black. These darker colors are susceptible to having a little bit of green tint in them with a large green screen so close by. And so the Luma mask is a way of acknowledging that, the green screen is not going to be really dark. And so the higher this value is, it basically sets a threshold for doing basically a Luma key and allowing the darker pixels to become more solid. So as I raise this, for example, it'll start to bring more solid pixels here in the shadows of the green screen. Of course, I don't want to go that high. I think I'm just going to do 0.1, and that'll just ensure that the shirt and the chair stay well keyed and stay solid, even if there's just a little bit of green on them. The intensity floor, well, that's just like an overall adjustment for the alpha channel. I'm just going to leave that set to 0, actually, in this case. And then alpha min and alpha divisor, these are effectively clipping values for the transparency and the solid opacity in the key. So as I increase the alpha min, you'll see that that eats away at the remaining semi-transparency. Still have a little bit right there. Let's just bring that up a little more. There we go. So this allows me to eat away any semi-transparent pixels that I want to be clear. And likewise, the alpha divisor is going to add a little more opacity or remove opacity from this solid pixel. So just keep that right there. That's good enough. All right, so those are those 4 values. So we're pretty good. Now, don't be fooled by the fact that the despill is not checked. Despill is by default active. We could go actually forever exploring the despill functions. I am just going to uncheck that. This means basically that I've, by default, this is a little counterintuitive. By default, the despill automatic is checked on. I have to activate the parameter in order to deactivate the automatic. And then I have all of these parameters here to basically define a fill color. You can see this is kind of purplish, and now it's filling in purple, identifying the green screen color, etc. Honestly, in this particular case, the automatic value is working out just fine, so I think I'm just going to leave that as is. I could probably spend some time adjusting that so that I didn't turn out quite so jaundiced looking, but for the purpose of this tutorial, we'll just skip over despill for now. Cropping could be useful. Like, for example, I have this little wire sticking out here. I can go ahead and crop left, dial that up just to crop that. Maybe there's a little bit of junk down here on the floor, so I'll crop the bottom, click and drag to the right. There we go. So that works pretty well as expected. The other area that maybe works a little counterintuitively is the color correction area. And this is, of course, really useful. But if I say check brightness and I click on this and I drag, nothing is happening, right? Okay, let me set that back to 1. The reason is that down below these settings, we have key 7, visualization. This is where we can activate color correction amount. Now, I could activate this and still brightness does nothing. What's up with that? Okay, the reason is that, I'll set that to 1, color correction amount is by default 0, meaning the color correction doesn't do anything. If I set this to 1 instead, now, finally, the color correction actually corrects the color. So wonderful. So activate this, make sure it's set to 1 to start off with, and then we can get to work on actually doing the color correction. Now, I typically want to make sure that I can see the results in the actual scene rather than pay attention just to this panel, because you can see already that these colors don't really match. And of course, this plane still has the original King Master. So let's take our material instance, drag that onto the plane, and now the settings that I'm adjusting here are going to affect the plane. So I might actually lower the brightness a little bit on this. I'm feeling like I'm a little overexposed there, so I might dial that down. And there we go. That's pretty good. Interesting. I'm just going to do 0.25. And that brings me into a good exposure. Gamma. Right, so all of these are now going to work as you might expect. I can lower my gamma, make this much more contrasty, increase the gamma, etc. I'll just hit cancel on that. I don't want to adjust that. Actually, I'm pretty happy with this value right there as it is. And so I'm just going to save it and close. Feel free to explore these and just understand that you have to activate the color correction amount and dial that all the way up to 1 in order for them to work. And then after the fact, once you've kind of dialed it in, you still have the ability to kind of blend between a value of 1 where color correction is full power, and you could attenuate that power just by dragging it down. This at 0 is without color correction. At 1, it's full color correction, and you can always choose some value in between if you like. All right, I'll leave this set to 1. We're saved, and that's it. I mean, really, at this point, we have set up a material instance that keys our value, our video. It's in the scene, it's live, and it's moving. Again, because I chose a translucent material, this is not casting any kind of shadow anywhere. And it is not honoring shallow depth of field. So if, for example, I move this out here into the scene, tap F to fit, bring this really close to the projection wall, obviously there is no shadow being cast by this. If I want shadow here, I'll double click and click on my material and set that to be masked. We won't see the change immediately. I'm just moving this out of the way so that I can hit the save button. As soon as I change to masked, now we have our shadow. This will also blur with shallow depth of field. And we get the side effect of choppy edges. As you can see there, if I look really close, you can see the noise cutting that up. So generally, I don't use the masked format unless I'm really going to need that shadow cast or that out of focus. You can go to translucent and save that. I will acknowledge that there's another YouTube tutorial channel, I think it's called Hubble Ninja, that shows a way of creating a second plane and layering them and casting a shadow. And that is a good workaround for at least casting shadow, but just be aware that you'll still have, using that approach, you'll still have the translucent frame that is visible to the camera, and that will not blur with the depth of field. All right, that's really the whole thing. I know this was a little bit more in depth and a little longer than usual, but hopefully it's of use. Hope this helps. Until next time, have fun.